All right. Hello, world. Hope everyone's listening online. We're about to get started here. And so today's speaker is Chris Esposito. I met Chris this past fall on a trip over to Tulane. He's not actually with Tulane, but he was kind enough to come to my talk. And so I ended up chatting with him and learned that he's doing a lot of work in marshes. And so I thought we have a lot of interest in marshes here at the Sea Lab, and so it might be good to get someone out from the Water Institute of Louisiana to Dauphin Island to talk a little bit about what he's doing in the marshes. And he's on the physical side of things, so I thought that might be a little change of pace than our more ecosystem, ecological talks. And so, Chris, have at it.
Great. Thank you. The story about polder number 2 was laid out in a paper in Nature Climate Change in 2015 by Auerbach et al. It's a really interesting story about this particular landscape. So a polder, by the way, for those of you who don't know, is simply a levee. So when I say this island is poldered, it means it's enclosed by a levee, and it's been drained. And it was drained in the mid-60s through the 70s, mostly for the purposes of agriculture. And in the 40 years after it was drained, they did this specifically so people could use it for agriculture. It attracted a whole lot of people to it. But, of course, draining it also caused a tremendous amount of subsidence. So the draining caused a lot of oxidation of organic material in the soil, caused death in the soil. And you ended up losing about 1.5 meters of elevation over the course of 40 years. So obviously in any low-lying coastal deltaic area, that's a big problem. That's an enormous risk. And I think you probably can see what's coming. In 2009, that risk caught up with this area. And a cyclone Ayla, blew through this area and caused a number of breaches in the polder, in the levee wall. And those breaches remained open, weren't able to be repaired for about 2 years. And during the course of 2 years, there was essentially unrestricted tidal exchange between, let's see if I can do this, between this river, this tidal river here, and the island itself in the polder. So after that breach was closed, after that series of breaches were closed, this team came in and they measured the deposit that was put there as a consequence of the tidal exchange, the exchange of water and sediment between the river and the channel. And they ended up finding, they documented tens of centimeters, if not a half a meter or more in some places, of sediment was emplaced in this area just over the course of 2 years of relatively unrestricted exchange between those. So the reason I tell that story is pretty much twofold. One, there's an obviously, this is, a catastrophic event for the people that lived in this environment. And I sort of don't want to be glib about that. It was a really devastating catastrophe for the people who lived here. But one can imagine a scenario where that exchange is managed in such a way that you're actually using the tidal exchange in this case, or fluvial exchange in other cases, to actually mitigate the risk that some of these communities see. And so you're using them to actually generate elevation capital rather than lose it. And this is, in my field at least, this is one of the big stories of the 21st century, is essentially giving communities and giving coastal populations ways that they can exert some control over their surrounding in the face of sea level rise and to mitigate the risk of living in these low-lying areas to begin with. So with that in mind, I'm going to introduce 3 chapters of this talk, and each of them is going to focus on some aspect of the exchange between the channel and the overbank environment. The first is called efficient retention of mud drives land building on the Mississippi Delta Plain. There we're going to focus on the overbank. After that, we're going to take a look at some leaky channels. We're going to look at flow loss from the perspective of the channels. This is flow loss in deltaic distributaries, so we're looking at the impacts on the channel morphology as a consequence of the exchange between the channels and the overbank environment. And the third is we're going to be looking back in the marsh. We're going to back to the overbank, and we're going to go into a marsh where we're looking at some transport thresholds for fine sediment. So that's most of the sediment, the mineral sediment at least, that makes up these marshes. Looking at transport thresholds in really low velocity fields in some marshes. So, and I should mention the first two projects here are completed work. They're finished, and they're either published or in the process of publication. And the third is pretty preliminary at this point. So we're just getting our data in a row, data analyzed and ducks in a row for the third. So I can sort of wave my hands and tell you a lot of really cool things that are definitely going to happen. The first project is efficient retention of mud drives land building on the Mississippi Delta Plain. The image that I'm showing you here is an image of the Mississippi Delta. It's a LiDAR image. It's a normalized LiDAR, but it's essentially a LiDAR image of the, this is Bayou Lafourche. So this area from Donaldsonville all down to Thibodaux is a relic channel of the Mississippi River. It's no longer active, but during the time that it was active, the exchange processes between the channel and the wetland built all of this, what you see as higher elevation land along its edges. And that land is where everybody in three parishes of Louisiana, Lafourche, Assumption, and St. James, all live. So everybody lives along along what you see here as orange. So that's just a way of pointing out that managing those processes is extremely important to manage the environment. A little bit of orientation. I'm going to show a map like this a number of times. What you see here is essentially the Mississippi River Delta. This is southeast Louisiana. The modern Mississippi River is this light blue line coming down from northwest to southeast. The Lafourche lobe of the Mississippi River is this channel network shown in purple. This is no longer an active channel network. There's a little bit of water flowing through it, but it's not too much bigger than a ditch at this point. But it carry about half of the discharge of the Mississippi River. And then all the way to the west here is the Atchafalaya system, including the Wax Lake Delta and the Atchafalaya Delta. And this actually is part of the modern Mississippi River system, and it connects somewhere up around here to the trunk channel. But I'm going to start, that's New Orleans where I live, that's the Wax Lake Delta. This is called the Bird's Foot Delta, and where I'm going to start is essentially the area that I showed in the previous image, is in this box right here. So back to that image I showed, one thing that I didn't point out is that you can see here a couple of areas where the land, right, the high elevation land, is sort of protruding out from the channel. It pokes out a little bit more here than it does on the other side. And in those areas, you can see sort of a network of channels. These are interpreted channels from LiDAR and subsurface information. But those channels are the conduits that really led to the sediment from the river coming out of the river and getting into the floodplain. And a lot of what I'm going to be focusing on is how those tiny little channel networks work and how these crevasse splays, this whole thing here would be a crevasse splay, how that functions and how it can be managed in the future. And a lot of the work in the Mississippi River Delta managing is essentially managing artificially created crevasse splays for the purpose of coastal restoration. So I'm going to approach this with two questions. The first is, what range of sediment retention efficiency can we expect in a crevasse splay during its lifetime? The reason we need to ask that, reason we need to answer it, is because when you're building a system like this, when you're doing this artificially, you really need to, you basically know how much bang for your buck you're getting, like how much of your sediment is going to be retained in the place that you want to keep it. And the second is, what are the environmental factors that are the most important to enhancing sediment retention efficiency in crevasse splays in the overbank environment more generally? So I use that metric. It's a really simple metric that I'm gonna talk about during this chapter, and it's just the sediment retention efficiency, and it's exactly what you would expect it to be. Right? The sediment retention efficiency is just the mass of sediment that is supplied to a landform that's also preserved in that landform. And the way that I'm going to measure it is simply by comparing the sand fraction in the input to the sand fraction in the deposit. And that might seem a little bit too simple, but what we're saying is that if you see a difference between the sand fraction in the input, so that's the fraction of the coming into this, if that is basically unchanged in the deposit, then we've got a very, what's going to happen is you're going to lose some of the finer material. So the deposit's going to end up being sandier than the input, and that loss of fine, loss of. So everything we're going to do is based on these really simple calculations of just quantifying the amount of sand in the deposit and estimating what that would be for the input. So with that in mind, just keep in mind that muddy deposits indicate efficient sediment traps, right? It means that there really isn't a lot of loss in a system like that. So the way we are going to do these measurements, the measurements we're actually taking, are based on this core record. And I think there's 132 cores. And they were collected over a series of studies, not all mine. I augmented this data set, but I can't claim credit for everything in here. So there's a lot of work done by a lab run by Torbjorn Tornquist over the course of about a decade. These cores were measured for sediment texture, so that's sand, silt, and clay, and then we were doing that in the field, and we were calibrating our measurements in the lab. And what we end up with is cross-sections like this. This is A to A prime right here. And we show these stratigraphic cross-sections by their texture. So each of these textures, so the reds are the sandiest material we have. The greens and the darker greens are organic material down at the bottom. And we're going to use this information and the geometry just to calculate how much sand we have actually preserved in this, what the fraction is of the entire deposit. So a quick little bit, I'm going to come back to this image, and I'm going to quick little bit of history of this area just so you know what you're looking at. This is, as I mentioned, this color here is the modern Mississippi River, and I'm looking at the picture right now that you would have seen 1,500 years or more. And at the time, this entire area, outlined, I have too much data to show past that, was a regionally continuous cypress swamp. And that cypress swamp is now preserved at the base of this splay as a peat layer. So this is a woody peat layer that represents what used to be a large cypress swamp. When Bayou Lafourche initially formed, right, and so it's called an avulsion, when it initially avulsed from the Mississippi River, it very quickly cut a channel through that cypress swamp and drowned the rest of it in these, what I have labeled as early Lafourche deposits. So this is true overbank sedimentation. This is what you would consider to be sort of distal floodplain clay deposits. And after about, I'd say, 300 or 400 years of this, we ended up with a breach in the levee, which that breach in the levee became what we see as the Atacapac crevasse. So this little protrusion of relatively coarser, siltier material here was a breach in the levee, which if you earlier, this is one of those sort of protrusions of higher elevation land. And that higher elevation land is the entire study site that we're looking at today. So back to this image here that I showed in the first place, we've done a lot of analysis to show that each of these texture types has a characteristic sand fraction. And once you identify that, it's really pretty quick to do and come up with in the total deposit that's about 4.5%. So it's not a lot. This is a really fine-grained environment. So very different from beaches and coasts and a lot of higher energy environments. This is really, it's just important to keep in mind in a restoration context. So that also, if you remember our equation earlier, that gives us the denominator. So that's the sand fraction in the deposit. We need to measure the sand fraction in the input now. And here, we can't actually measure that because we don't have the relic channel preserved. We can't actually go back and measure the sand fraction in the input. So we're going to make some assumptions based on how rivers work and how the modern Mississippi River transports sediment. So what we're going to do is assume that we've got a 5-meter deep crevasse in a 30-meter deep channel. And we're essentially decanting the sediment from the top 5 meters of that channel into the splay. And so we're going to split this up into the sand load and the mud load. The sand is going to follow a Rouse profile, which is a pretty typical sediment profile for open channels. And you can see that this is what you do with the bed. It gets much less concentrated near the surface. And we're going to assume that the mud, right, the finer material, is well mixed. And then we have to make some assumptions about the velocity and also about the total amount of sand and mud in suspension. We're going to take all from modern data. So once you mix that all up, what you can do is you can get the sand to mud ratio in the top 5 meters, and we're simply going to apply that to the splay. And what we end up with is the modern yearly sand fraction in the input is somewhere around 60%. So that's a little bit disconcerting because that's actually higher than the sand fraction in the deposit. If we were to use that as the S of I in our equation, we'd end up with a sediment retention efficiency of about 145%. So you have to, accept a certain amount of error in measurements where you're making inferences like that, but that's still a pretty unsatisfying answer. But there's a lot of evidence that the modern mud load in the Mississippi River has been declining, and that's mostly as a result of human modifications to the system, and that what we're looking at now is totally different than what we would have experienced about 15. And again, we have to make a pretty substantial amount of inferences here, but most estimates say that reduction is somewhere on the order of 30 to 50% reduction in the mud load in the Mississippi River, while and pretty much unchanged. So if that's the case, we can go back and recalculate the sediment fraction in the input using different mud loads, and we end up with a sediment retention efficiency of somewhere between 75 and 100%. So we're saying that this is a pretty good sediment trap, and what is provided to it, 75%, remain there. So the reason that's important, the reason that's important in a restoration context, really has to do with comparison with an environment like this. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. It's become a very well-known analog for land building sediment diversions in the Mississippi River. But when people actually go and measure the sand fraction, when they actually do around 5 to 40% efficient if you actually do the same calculation we do. And the reason for that is because it's sitting right at the coast, and all of that mud is coming out of here and just getting right onto the shelf very quickly. So this is, for people who plan these systems, a really important lesson that you have to take into consideration the regional perspective, because the protection that was offered to this environment for it being so much further inland is really substantial, and we end up getting, we were talking about bang for our buck earlier, twice as efficient, at least, as a place like the Wax Lake Delta. So the two take-home messages of this part are, one, sediment retention efficiency in a crevasse splay can exceed 75% and may approach 100%. So that's in a local environment, you might really get nearly 100% capture. It's could really be quite close to it. And then the other is that location. So the location of these large river diversions is going to be a primary determinant of their. Not just the location on the river It's really the location in the broader delta plain environment that determine whether or not they retain the amount of sediment that you expect them to. So it's all about the overbank environment, and now I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk about the channel some. The second chapter here is flow loss in deltaic distributaries, impacts on channel morphology. So we're really talking about leaky channels here and what the loss of flow and what the exchange is due to the channel itself. I'm showing you a photograph here to motivate this, taken about 1.5 miles from my house in New Orleans. I live pretty close to the river, actually in the lower Ninth Ward, in an area that's elevated still because it's quite close to the river. And this is the Mississippi River. I used to have a date on here. I don't see it, but I think this was from the 2015 flood. The river stage at this time was about 4 meters, and I happen to know that the elevation of this road here is about 2 meters. So that's just a really obvious indication that the levees are, which isn't, a surprise. Like look up to the bottom of ships as they go by most times. But this difference, right, this is also an indication in the context that I'm talking about, severely modified. So it's not just affecting the overbank, we're also really affecting how the channel itself functions because we're affecting the exchange. And I'm curious to see what impact that has on the channel. A little bit of background on what we call the backwater hydraulic story in rivers that discharge to the coast. This is a story that's been developed and brought into the geomorphology literature by Mike Lamb and a number of his colleagues since 2012. And the story itself is I think, pretty interesting. If you have this is what you're looking at right now is a river at low flow. Like on the right is the hinterland, and the river is coming in and discharging at sea level. So far from the shoreline, the slope of the river is approximately paralleling the land. But when you get near sea level, you're faced with an absolute constraint that the water surface elevation of the river has to meet the water surface elevation of in this case, in the Mississippi, it's the Gulf of Mexico. So that means that the river basically has to bend that surface profile upwards, which means that you are expanding the cross-sectional area of the channel, and that leads to a decrease in velocity as you get close to the shoreline. At high flow, we call this backwater. At high flow, the situation is different. In fact, it's essentially the opposite. We have a lot of stage variation upstream. So upstream in Vicksburg or so, you might get about 30 feet of elevation change between low flow and high flow. As that profile comes down, it has to do the opposite. It has to bend essentially downwards to meet the Gulf of Mexico. And so that means that the cross-sectional area is decreasing as you're going downstream, and the velocities are increasing. And there's a lot of data showing that the balance between these competing scenarios are affecting how the channel functions. They're affecting the bed morphology of the Mississippi River and other coastal deltaic river channels. So my in this is I really want to know how restricting the exchange affects that story. Have is channels that are very highly managed, and they don't have these exchange processes between the channel and the overbank environment. So this is some data from the So this is just a hypothetical model based on the backwater and drawdown curves that I showed you, and there's a lot of evidence that this is fairly accurate. I'll walk you through this really fast. Let me take some of this stuff off of the screen. This is, I've sort of reversed the axis. So the shoreline now is to the right. And this line, this black line, is what we're calling the potential annual bed elevation. So that's essentially the amount of scour versus the amount of deposition that can happen during the course of a typical flood. And if you take a typical flood in the Mississippi River, you'll find that as you get towards the bed, as you get towards the shoreline, that scour, that's the drawdown phase, typically seems to outpace the backwater phase where you would get deposition. And if you just do the hydraulics, you would think that there's probably a scour towards the mouth of the Mississippi River as you're going really south of New Orleans. And in fact, there's a good bit of data that shows that to be the case. This is the deposition by river reach in the Mississippi River, and you can see this line here is 0, and once you get below around 200 kilometers north of the shoreline, you actually do start to get more scour than you do further north. So it seems to be in agreement with this special elevation annual change process. I will mention, I get this question a lot, the Corps of Engineers has to spend an enormous amount of money dredging to keep the channel clear. So it's a little bit contradictory for me to say that there's actually scouring in this reach. But actually, all of the dredging budget in the Mississippi River is in this area right here. So it's sort of, after you get beyond this scour, it silts in very, very, and that's why we have such a problem with keeping the channel clear. And this is a little more evidence that this scouring effect in the lower 200 meters of the river, this is from Jeff Nitrauer's dissertation work, or a master's work actually, in 2011. And what you're looking at are, these are called flutes. These are sedimentary structures that indicate erosion into a bed into a non-sandy bed. So this is hard clay that's being eroded, and each of these little scoops is an indication of that erosion in multi-beam bathymetry image. So again, the question I was going to ask is, does preventing that flow loss influence the sedimentary response in the backwater reach? And has the modern flood protection system altered the bed morphology of the Mississippi River? I'm not going to dwell on this equation, but these are the equations that we use to make those backwater and drawdown curves. And the work of this project was mostly to add this extra term here. This is an extra loss. It's essentially an extra friction where we can account for momentum loss due entirely to mass loss from the system based on the lateral exchange. And what we did with that is we recast these equations that we showed earlier for the backwater and drawdown curve and essentially redid some calculations where we actually incorporated losses into them. So one question, right, to actually tie this into reality, you have to know how much the Mississippi River lost, because we don't have really very good estimates, right? Like right now, it's pretty well contained. We know it loses through the Bonnie Carey spillway and a couple of other places, but by and large, we don't know how much was lost from the channel before the advent of the levee system. So I went back and did some data mining. This was really fun, by the way. I don't often use 1867 references. I went to some old Mississippi data and found measurements that these guys took in crevasses forming as a flood took place. So at this time, the river was mostly leveed, but they were really poor levees. So they broke all the time. Every flood they would break. So I'm using the information of loss during a flood in 1858 to indicate sort of a lower limit on how much flow the Mississippi River could have lost during that time. And the answer I come up with is in the comparison between these two lines. The sort of dot dash line at the top is the model rerun with losses allowed per that 1858 condition. And the solid line here is the model run with no losses allowed. That's the line that you saw earlier where we had some scour towards the mouth of the river. And what you can see is that the difference between the two of these is mostly towards the mouth of the river, right? So if you're asking the question, did the levying of the river end up contributing to the scour of the bed, it very well might have, but it was likely only on the lowermost reaches. And this is just a little caveat, but mostly the loss in flow affected the furthest south reaches of the Mississippi River. And so that's in my mind, just a really interesting, important historical context for what the levee system has actually done to the river. And the message is this bottom thing here. So even minor losses in quite a deep river can have some significant influence on the bed morphology. Okay, so that's chapter 2, and I guess I have this up here. This is an abbreviated version of the story. We actually have some more information from some channel networks that are very lossy down in the Birdsfoot Delta, which is a part of the publication, but doesn't usually fit into the talk. The third chapter here is we're going to go back into the overbank environment. So this is deposition thresholds for fine sediment in vegetation. This is a project that's ongoing right now. It's supported by the National Academy of Sciences. This is NASGRP funding. And this is a collaboration between us at the Water Institute of the Gulf, MIT, where Heidi Nepf here runs a very good lab where she looks at the dynamics of water and sediment inside of vegetation, so inside of marshes, and Tulane University, which is, this is my master's student, Marcel Beltran Burgos. So, there we go. A little bit of motivation of how this study came to be. I spent my master's studying mouth bars like this one in the Mississippi River. And this image here is from a publication that came out of my master's where we were looking to estimate the flood deposit thickness on a mouth bar and compare that with some numerical models that were looking at the dynamics of flow and sediment in a mouth bar. And basically what they were saying is what we came up with. You would get this thick deposit around the sort of edge of the mouth bar, and at the apex it's a little bit thinner and maybe even a bypass zone entirely. When we were doing this work, I would always go down in so March or April, and when I was down there, the mouth bar would look like this, like you see here. This arrow, this white arrow, corresponds to that location. And you can see that it's pretty much barren, right? You can't see anything but open water. There's no vegetation on it at all. But if we ever came back later in the year, this particular picture is November from the same location, obviously it's different. So something's happened here that I wasn't capturing, right? And it wasn't, it just, I knew something was up, and it wasn't like I was trying to hide it, but I just hadn't incorporated those vegetation effects at all. Here's another sort of way of looking at this. Is at a location extremely close to that mouth bar I was looking at. This is in July of 2015. 2015 was a really neat year because we have a flood that lasted well into July to August, which is not typical on the Mississippi River. And I was lucky enough to help lead a trip for the NCED, that's the National Center for Earth Surface Dynamics Summer Institute, in July of 2015 to this field site. One of the activities that the students did there, which was really neat, was looking at, so these are all sedimentologists, so everyone's looking at the sediments here, and what we ended up doing was we tried to look at this layer of unconsolidated sediment as a function of the vegetation community. And in this case, we have these two stands. One is Sagittaria, and the other is a Typha species back in here. And if you can look, the Sagittaria, which is relatively sparse, has a much thicker package of this unconsolidated sediment than the Typha does over here. And we're interpreting that unconsolidated material as recent deposition. I think that's pretty reasonable thing to do. But the thing that we were really struck by is that the vegetation is playing a really active role in dictating where the sediment gets distributed on this landscape. So there's a huge difference between this and that, and it seems to be a function entirely of the vegetation. This isn't like groundbreaking. I'm not the first person that had this idea. There are a lot of other people that have done this kind of work. I'm showing a couple of pieces of numerical modeling. This is in a landscape similar to the Wax Lake Delta, where these guys, William Narden and Doug Edmonds, were looking at the optimum vegetation height and spacing for sediment retention in a delta like this. There's also a lot of information from coastal marshes, some in Barnegat Bay, looking at how restoration projects influence sediment transport and vegetation, and also from places like Plum Island Sound a little bit further north, and also in my own work. This is some work that I've done at the Water Institute, where we're looking at function. We really want to know what this environment is going to be like over several decades of diversion function. So it's certainly an active topic, but it's really difficult to look at the small scale processes of sediment and bring that to a landscape scale like this. And part of the reason has to do with this work. This is some work that came out of Heidi Knepp's lab. This is Lou and Knepp from 2016, and they are looking at just a pattern, right? So these are wooden dowels, so it's about as simple as you can imagine them. And they used the data from this study to identify a stem Reynolds number. So Reynolds number is just a really very common hydraulic scaling parameter that tells you about the turbulent properties of the flow. And they identified a stem Reynolds number that was, in this case, a function of the velocity at the head of the patch, the stem diameter, and then that nu down here is the kinematic viscosity of water. That would tell them whether or not turbulence was being generated in these patches that was sufficient to influence the deposition of vegetation. So what they found was at lower Reynolds numbers, in this case 75, and the Reynolds is very, very specific to their specific setup. But at this Reynolds number of 75, you can see these tendrils of fluorescein dye are making their way all the way through the patch, right? So you can see them coherently exiting the patch, and you can trace them all the way through. So that's indicating pretty much laminar flow inside of the patch, and you're not getting a lot of turbulent mixing. And that's also in the sedimentation. In this observed relative to the out-of-patch environment. Hopscotch over to the right side of the screen at a higher Reynolds number of 220, and you see this whole big cloud coming out here. Here, it's a totally different situation where you get a lot of turbulence being generated in the patch, and in that case, the in-patch deposition is suppressed relative to the environment outside of the patch. And they identified a transition both in their visualization of the turbulence and also in the sedimentation patterns of about a Reynolds number of 120. Okay? So that's actually really interesting in the context of those modeling studies that I showed earlier, because what I didn't mention is that all of those modeling studies, and virtually every model that I know of that deals with sediment transport, has the sediment transport some function of bed stress, this tau b. But here, they're showing in a lab pretty clearly that turbulence is the main driver of vegetation. And it's not entirely clear that these two things should be interchangeable. And in fact, I'll show a couple of little experiments here to dig into that a little bit more. This is a numerical model of, this is a Delft3D, which is it's a landscape scale morphological model that I use, and it's very common in coastal settings. And the model is set up, it's just this very simple domain where we're inputting water to the left, and we have a constant water level condition at the right, and the water flows around a patch of vegetation. And I have put in a specific stem density and stem diameter, which gets translated into some hydraulic parameters. It's a rough in the model. I'm showing two sets of data. This is the velocity, and this is the bed stress. As I mentioned, bed stress is usually what sediment transport calculations are based off of. The velocity we can use to calculate that Reynolds number, that stem Reynolds number. And so what I've done here is I've taken the calculated stem Reynolds number in that patch of vegetation and plotted it against the bed stress in that patch of vegetation. And each dot here represents a single cell in the model in that patch. And I'm going to start breaking this up a little bit by a couple of different thresholds. This is the 120 stem Reynolds threshold that we showed that was identified. And this is a threshold that we often use in our numerical modeling, a threshold of erodibility of deltaic of the type we find in the Mississippi Delta. And this is from a considerable amount of field data. There's a lot of flex in this, but this is a reasonable one to use. We now have the parameter space divided up into 4 quadrants. And the interesting thing is they don't quite agree with what we would think based on Reynolds number or bed stress. In the lower left, they actually do. In the lower left, we have a Reynolds number that's low enough to allow sedimentation, and we have bed stress that's low enough to allow sedimentation. In the upper right, it's the opposite. Both of them are high enough that they would be expected to prevent deposition. But in the lower right, and this is where most of our data is, and this is a physically realistic model that we ran, where most of our data is, we would get a Reynolds number that was high enough to actually prevent deposition, but a bed stress that's low enough to allow it. And so that's a really confusing thing, because we have all these landscape scale numerical models that are basing their calculation on bed stress. But it seems that if you think of this with turbulence instead, you might get a very different answer. So this whole project is designed to dig into that question. What we're doing, and again, I mentioned that I'm going to set up what we're doing and show you where we're headed, but this is not a completed work here. We have a marsh in the Mississippi River Delta that we're monitoring, and we're monitoring it for suspended sediment, sediment accretion, the vegetation morphology, which will be important in a moment, and also flow parameters like velocity and turbulence. And we're really trying to see if those ideas from a lab are translatable into the field, and if turbulence is determining the patterns of deposition in this environment. So a quick video. This is our marsh from, I think, March of 2018. That was last year, all the way through June. And you can see it's dominated by, this is Typha, and it grows very tall. But one thing that's important to notice is that almost nothing that you see here matters even a little bit to the actual sediment dynamics, because that's all happening down here close to the bed. So a lot of our initial assumptions about how these places work were based on studies of vegetation that looked like this. It's not a rigid wooden dowel, but they're relatively simple forms, and they can really be incorporated into that stem Reynolds number by identifying a stem diameter pretty easily. But what ends up determining the flow and determining how the marsh actually functions is this understory vegetation, which in this case is alligator weed, which is an invasive that is so widely spread out in Louisiana that I didn't know it was invasive until very recently. And you can see that this area, this is where Leland is standing, it's completely choked off by it. And so the way that the alligator weed sits underwater is really different. Some of it floats. It's got a really complicated structure. It's got leaves. We can't really identify just a very easy stem diameter to test that Reynolds number threshold. So a lot of what we're doing is trying to recast that Reynolds number in terms of something like solid volume fraction, or maybe like a cross-sectional frontal area. And this is what we're working towards in the remainder of the study. We have a couple of lab experiments to go, and we're going to do one where we take some plants and do a PIV, this particle imaging velocimetry, around that to look at how that functions in the lab. I do want to show just a couple of other slides and wrap this up just to sort of tell you where I'm going with this. This was a lot of fun. We did this last week, and it's the first time I had ever done this. We did a dye injection that we photographed from above from a drone. So we had been, for most of a field season, going out with measuring velocity throughout the marsh, and we really satisfying. And the velocities were so local, we just didn't think we were really good information about how the marsh was functioning. And so we went out and we found someone who could get a drone, and we just poured rhodamine into this marsh and watched how it flowed through it. And it's really useful in a way of identifying preferential flow paths through the marsh that you might not have otherwise seen. They actually, I don't have the quantitative images yet, but I don't have, this was just last week that we did this, but the preferential flow paths that your eye picks up in here is actually not really where the water's going, which was really interesting to us. It was actually sort of diving through this vegetated area, which was a total shock. But you can see the dye, you can see some of that pink coming out. We had an array of fluorometers to test this. So I'm really looking forward to this data set when it comes out, because that's going to be integrated with quality sampling and our measurements. So that's sort of the next step in this project, with much more to come, and I'm very looking forward to showing folks that when they're available. And I want to close by just showing one other aspect of this project, which has been really unique. Is this we established this panel. It's called a practitioner advisory panel, and we did a lot of work at the beginning of the project looking for people that did restoration work. So these are organizations that do vegetation plantings or monitoring of marshes, and people who did that with a pretty high level for scientific background. So these are practitioners in the coastal restoration field who are either active researchers or really are very, very thoughtful and very careful about how they do their work and what they do. And we put this panel together in order to advise the project and also to generate a conduit for our work to put out in the hands of people that can actually use it. And I guess one is just me saying that I heavily recommend something like that. It's really changed my mind on a lot of things and changed my perspective and how I'm able to put this project together in a way that's meaningful scientifically and also impactful. It's also been we've generated a couple of different project ideas from it, and the one that I'm really excited about right now, and I'm excited to look for people that are interested in working in this place, is I have we essentially organized a large-scale vegetation planting. This is in a place called Baie Denise. This is in an area that's very similarly diversion outfall area is going to look like. It's pretty much open water. It's shallow. It already actually receives a lot of water from the river through all of these channels connect to the river just a couple miles to the south here. And it's basically this bay is filling up, and we're trying to organize the planting so that we can see increase the efficiency of the system. If we can catch another 5% of sediment over the next amount. So that's, in an area where you're really trying to portion out sediment to specific locations, that's a meaningful thing. So what we're going to end up with is the configuration has changed a lot. We're probably going to have a much wider area of this planted with Ziziniopsis, which is giant cut grass. And we're looking for ways of monitoring that from ecological standpoint. We have some microbiologists that I'm trying to get involved, carbon sequestration, and also my field, just physical sediment retention in that area. And so I'm really trying to find ways to integrate as many different types of work in the area. And it's a really cool study site, reasonably controlled, but not lab scale. So that's all come out of that practitioner advisory panel, which I've really enjoyed working with. And in the end, and I guess the reason I usually show this is to make one particular point, is we're also looking to see whether you can use vegetation as an active engineered aspect of the landscape. There is this terrace field over here in a similar environment that was built in 2006. You can see how much deposition it's actually caused around here. All of these little islands, all of this land that's been formed is a result of that terrace field slowing down the flow through that bay. The question then is, can you use a significant vegetation planting, which costs an order of magnitude less, to get something similar to that same response, and really start thinking more clearly about using, I want to say soft engineered structures and vegetation as an active element in the landscape. So I knew I still had this. I just talked through all my final thoughts in the last slide, so I'm not actually going to final thought here anymore. But everything that I have presented here today is really with an eye on taking what we know about